Hello and welcome to Grief Tending. This is a podcast series that aims to support anyone who's in a caregiving role to someone who is or will be grieving. These conversations are seeking to cultivate our collective capacities to be alongside grief and suffering in supportive ways. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians and owners on whose unceded lands these interviews are recorded, the Turrbal and Yagara people, to acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, waters and culture, and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend those respects to any First Nations people who are listening. Today's episode sits within the health professional stream of our series and is entitled On Unexpected Thresholds, Grief and Suffering as a Doorway to Hope, Inspiration and Joy. Our guest for this episode is Tom Grothe. And Tom is a nurse practitioner and psychotherapist who's provided primary, palliative and hospice care for over 40 years. He was an active marriage family therapist and had a psychotherapy practice that focused on multiple losses and quality of life. Tom worked as a hospice nurse in the early days of the hospice movement and was charge nurse of the world's first AIDS and cancer inpatient hospice. His symptom management approach to disease progression empowers patients and families to promote and maximize quality of life in accordance with their values and wishes, and to make a plan of care that honors those wishes. Tom is also the author of Fallen Sparrows. He lives in San Francisco with his husband and their 2 rescue cats. He practices yoga daily and also sings in a semi-professional choir. This episode of Grief Tending is titled On Unexpected Thresholds, Grief and Suffering as a Doorway to Hope, Inspiration and Joy. And I really valued the opportunity to speak with Tom in hearing him reflect on, many decades of work in a therapeutic setting alongside people experiencing grief and bereavement, and the ways in which he has sought to draw on what he terms elevating emotions, hope, joy, inspiration, playfulness and laughter as a way of supporting people not only to process their grief, but also to explore what it might be to reauthor their sense of belonging and purpose and meaning in the world. This is so often such a vast sense of loss for bereaved people that can endure for many months, if not years, as people seek to re-piece the world back together, except none of those old pieces quite fit and seem to be not able to be rearranged into what was, because what was is gone in some way. But speaking about this can quite quickly seem to get abstract or conceptual. But, the term that's often used is a sense of existential distress or existential suffering. And so I valued hearing how Tom has drawn on principles from existential therapy and those approaches to support people to reauthor their own sense of meaning and connection in life. And I think this episode will be really relevant for anyone who is either in psychosocial spiritual care or more broadly in palliative care. If you've supported anyone where you've seen this what often can be very deep-seated and long-lasting existential distress be present, where people really struggle and wrestle with the loss of their old meanings. And so they're very big and complex topics, but I valued the way in which Tom grounded these in examples of his own experiences from working in the early days of the hospice movement, the world's first AIDS hospice, and the vibrancy of the way he described some of the time there. But also his encouragement for people to engage with art and music, not as background distractions, but as intentional ways of engaging aspects of their grief. How has it been for you in your life? Have you encountered pieces of art that have stopped you in your tracks, or encouraged you to reflect or think differently on some aspect of your own being, or how you relate to something in the world? For me, music has played a powerful role in that way, in shaping my worldview, the things that I have felt to be important, and also at times of immense suffering. There are places and aspects of our being that music can connect to and help us work with, that we might not otherwise be able to access. So I valued the practical suggestions. I valued the very broad ranging existential reflections, and I hope that there is something in this episode that you find useful to your work context, wherever you are and whoever you're supporting in your world. May this be helpful to you. Thanks. Hi, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Greetings.
So I wanted to start out by asking you about change as it relates to grief. It seems that if grief is a response to loss, which is caused by a significant change in someone's life circumstances, in people's grief experience, it seems that some people, while they encounter grief, as a very heartbreaking and painful experience, some people seem to be able to incorporate or integrate that experience into their lives in a way that, for want of a better term, makes sense. Often people talk about sense making in grief, and that we know that takes place over different amounts of time for different people. But that it also seems that for other people, along with the pain of a diagnosis, either for themselves or for their partner, or the death of a family member, along with that kind of, I suppose, trigger for a grief event, there comes these sort of additional layers of loss. And I know you've talked in your work about multiple losses. It's the loss of this world that they knew, the world that functioned in a particular way and had a certain order and could be trusted. I was thinking that there's these lines from the poet Jennifer Wellwood, who she talks about this almost as a betrayal, that people might encounter this as some sort of betrayal, as if the line she has, I think, is as if life has broken her secret promise to us. Mm-hmm. So when I wanted to ask you to speak about these additional layers of losses that come along, because often the focus or the attention goes to the grief event rather than the multiple layers that exist within the wider process.
Thank you, Elam. I think that's a very eloquent question, and with many layers to it. A lot of what I've learned about grief comes from two populations that I didn't know had anything to do with each other. And that is when I was working with primarily gay men dying of HIV in the 80s to 90s, and another group of people that have similarity, which is really, really old people. And the similarities with both of these groups is their losses are kind of unending. The gay man not only has HIV and may be dying himself, but perhaps his partner had died before him, and the mailman and the florist and their best friend. So there's these multiple losses in this community during the early ages of AIDS, that when I started working with chronically ill, very frail older folk, I experienced or I witnessed that they were experiencing the same thing. Their husband had died 2 years ago. They're now bedbound and unable to get out of their house. Their best friend is gone. Their brother is gone. And so these multiple losses pile on top of folk. And often our grieving experience of each loss is in a different place. where your wound is fresh from having lost your cat, and your wound of having lost your husband 2 years before is in a different place. And so, one of the answers to that question, I think, Elam, is that life is, we are all multiply bereaved, and we are all always in some measure of grief. And I don't want to lessen the freshness of a new deep wound, but I think it's important that sometimes we acknowledge that we are all bereaved, and that agreement that we have with the world for everything to go on the way that it was, the way that we built it, the way that we wanted it, well, that's not really going to happen for any of us, is it? We're all going to eventually rupture that fantasy, and we're all going to struggle with the losses that are part of being alive. But unless you engage with life, you're always going to be pained when you lose the things that you've engaged with and loved. But if you don't do it, you haven't lived. So it's the same, it's two sides of the same thing, which is life.
Mm. Yeah, and it seems that, yeah, there is this interrelationship. When you were talking, this kind of this movement together seems so woven into the experience, but yet so difficult for people to comprehend or wrestle with.
It can be difficult. Of course it's difficult, because the truth or the reality is there, and you can't get beyond it. The person I love the most in the world has died, and that is heartbreaking. But if we look at what's happening around us, it sometimes can expand our horizons of who we are or what the world is. It gives us a more real view. And if you're living right on the edge of that sorrow, you also have this opportunity, I think, to really look at the world. And sometimes then you become more alive in your grief.
Mhm. Yeah, and I certainly see that. I certainly encounter that in walking alongside people who are grieving, and often grieving very, very recent and very raw losses. I think there seems to be something about the encounter you know, at different times. I see that I try and understand the causes for it in different ways, whether it's something around the kind of hyper individualism that exists in typically in like westernized society, or the distance people maybe have from death and dying compared to generations ago, so that those, I can hear you talking about multiple losses, but for many people, those death-related losses come with such a foundational, almost sense of shattering of the world that they knew, right? Like, it's possible to get much further along in life, perhaps, is what I'm trying to say, before the primal shock of that really comes face to face, in terms of, if we're speaking in terms of palliative care or in death. And I just, I think that seems such a struggle for people, that in addition to the heartbreak of the loss of that relationship on this physical plane, there's the vastness of this loss of the world as it was imagined to be.
Yes, the safety of your world, your cocoon, your loves, your house. Suddenly death is in all of that. And that really makes a person question their world, their worldview. It's not uncommon around when people are bereaved that they look at the dogmas that they've lived in their life, the religions or the spiritual trainings or beliefs, or just the assumptions that they've made. And they start to ask themselves, is that real? Is that helpful to me? did the Buddha send this our way, or did Jesus give us this terrible loss? And they ask themselves, what is the value of these dogmas that have given me comfort? And so, very often in a person in bereavement, they it appears to me that often people look at the big questions in life. And there's an opportunity there, I think, Elam, for people to re examine what's meaningful to them. And so we can talk about a shattering of a worldview, but we can also talk about a stepping into the light, into the truth of the pain of life. And each person then has an opportunity to decide what's meaningful to them. They get to go back and look at what their belief systems were, how to explain this terrible loss in their life. And sometimes, often, I find people reconstruct meaning in their life in a more powerful and healing way.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and speaking of healing, that I've heard you talk about that in relation to the process of suffering. So typically, suffering can be approached, particularly from a medical perspective, in terms of we need to titrate that symptom, for example, or like reduce that and make it go away as swiftly as we can. But in the way you have just described that, it brings much more value, or much more, one would say, purpose, although that's a loaded term. But that suffering is not pointless. It's very much a process that seems to be reluctant to say transforming, because that's not necessarily appropriate, but you know what I mean? There's this kind of evolution of not only who we imagine ourselves to be, but the whole perception of the world around us as well, through that process of suffering.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I know that you had made comments before with me, talking to me about existentialism. And I essentially, in my therapeutic work, I do take a bit of an existential stance, which is that each of us gets to define what's meaningful in our life. And that means every event that occurs to us, we get to decide what it means. And so often I work with people about, don't just step into your perceived dogmas, past dogmas, but really think about what this means. And when a person loses a child or their spouse, it's not unusual for them to find meaning in their life by uh, by protecting the memory of their loved one. So someone whose child dies of a terrible cancer may become committed to trying to heal this cancer so other people don't suffer the way their baby did. And this gives meaning to their life. And meanings can change over the course of a life. So maybe this would be their meaning for a few years, and maybe other things would step in to resolve that. But the point I'm making is, defining what's meaningful in our life gives us reason to get up in the morning. It When you have a meaning to your life, you can cope with just about anything that's coming your way. I think Nietzsche said it is, if you have a why, you can cope with any how. Whatever comes your way, you can face it if you have a reason to face it. So I often encourage people to think about that and to wonder, what is it that they're getting up in the morning for, especially people who are acutely bereaved. Because I understand it's unendurably painful. But if the pain and the suffering has meaning or reason or a goal, it becomes more tolerable.
Yeah, and in learning to in learning to endure the unendurable. I suppose you've talked in that process of supporting people to find, to identify and to rediscover almost a sense of meaning in this new world. That in that process, despite the fact that often the narrative of grief really highlights sadness, pain, loss, these kind of emotions, which typically might get labeled, stereotypically negative, dark, something like this. That you have, you focus on a broader, on making sure that there's space to include some broader things in the broader spectrum of life. Can you talk to us
Yes, and that's a beautiful segue, I think, Ellen, because while I like to focus people on what juices you up, what gives you meaning, how do you get up in the morning and face your grief, and while it is vital that people experience their pain and really feel their grief, there's another part to this that is often forgotten. And that is, I am a real proponent that we can learn much about ourself and our suffering through a focus on elevating emotions. And those elevating emotions are joy, inspiration, and hope. And so I think in the bereavement community, we sometimes make a mistake that we always must dwell on talking about the loved one, crying, getting out the sad emotions. It's very possible that people can heal and heal in an authentic way that's true to themselves by focusing on elevating emotions. And there are very specific and simple ways to do that. And these are based on a Swiss psychoanalyst. Her name is Verena Kast, Kast. She wrote a great book called Joy, Inspiration, and Hope. It's for psychoanalysts, but I think there's a lot in it. And she just talks about if you're going to balance your life, even in the midst of your grief, it's important that you learn from, acknowledge, and live with your elevating emotions. And oftentimes a bereaved person will say, like, I can't do that. I'm miserable. I'm suffering. It's like, okay, here's something you can do. It's a recommendation on in her book called An Autobiography of Joy. It's very simple. You can think back. You're asked to think back to a time where you had joy in your life, the birth of your child, a wedding, a day at the beach with your mom, and you really go into the memory of it. You think of what it felt like, who was there, the breeze across your face, the smells in the air, the taste of the pretzel, whatever. Go into it. Really remember that joyful moment. That does two things. One is, in the moment, it actually balances what you're feeling. You actually can rekindle the joy that you had in your life. And the other thing is, in doing that, it kind of kickstarts the elevating emotions, and you can start to feel elevated. You can experience joy and inspiration. Inspiration, the difference, the opposite of expiration, right? So I think there's a lot to that, and it's often looked as escapist, or some people look at it that way. I don't. I think that it can be a balance. It's part of who we are as humans. We need to play. We need to laugh. We need to love. We need to connect. And so re engaging in those emotions can be a path to learning about yourself, can be a path to integrating your loss.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it's so interesting. As you're talking, I'm thinking around how so often the story that's told, when people are grieving, often really does highlight that, often exclusively highlights the pain, the sadness, the difficulty, and sometimes wondering around, especially if people often in contemporary society have been spared that for so many years of their life, it's a very uncomfortable place specifically because it's so unfamiliar. For many people, there's kind of
Yeah.
almost this privilege, this strange privilege that comes with, if you haven't experienced multiple bereavements until you are a bit later in life, the discomfort and the pain of that is so unfamiliar, it can bring this additional kind of fear with it, so that seems to dominate the conversation a lot more. Whereas even in
I would
those
also make the I would also make the point there that oppressed populations have a deeper affinity with their suffering, and it's a little harder for people of color uh, or other folk who are oppressed to always to live in that bubble. That it's a little easier for the dominant culture to so there are many populations in the world that have already had this bubble ruptured of perfection. And
right,
sorry.
and that bubble is somehow, somehow a strange appearance in recent, in certain parts of the world, in certain more contemporary settings, that seems to offer this illusion of a life without suffering, when this is just not the reality.
Yes.
That's not what life. To go back to that poem, that is not life's promise. that you will be born and endure life without suffering. This is.
Right.
So in that experience, though, even for people who are experiencing that deep, deep shock, there are moments of laughter and of joy. It's one of the things I often say. I think people would believe, would be the least likely thing people would believe in a children's hospice, for example, where I work. Like
Yeah.
within the hour of children dying, at times,
Yes.
the family
Yes.
are around the bedside, and there is belly laughter that you can hear up the hallway, alongside deep wailing and crying, that the sound of which stays with you for a very long time because it's so
Mhm.
heartbroken. But that it is absolutely possible for these two vast and immense things to be present seemingly simultaneously. This seems one of the most difficult things to communicate.
And that is so real because I worked in a hospice, inpatient hospice, the world's first AIDS hospice, and we had 2 deaths a week for a decade.
Mm,
So we really went through it, and it's hard to imagine that this would be a sacred space or a joyful space, but it was. Like the Christmas show was like nothing else. So I do get that it's hard to imagine it, but it is absolutely there that they exist simultaneously.
mm, mm. And this seems to be something that, as you say, people who have not had this strange and unrealistic bubble of going through life imagining that suffering won't happen to them or only happens to other people. People's.
Yeah, and I think that one approach to folk like that who are deeply in their grief and can't imagine that they can get out of their grief and can't imagine they can return to their world is maybe they're not ready to focus on an autobiography of joy where they think of a happy time in the past. But what they can do, Elam, is go inward. The the arts, looking at a beautiful picture or putting on a beautiful piece of music or contemplating a flower at a bedside. These are quiet joys, but they're still joyful. And so, even if a person is bedbound, cannot move, there are ways of bringing joy to them through playing a beautiful symphony or wonderful folk song or remembering a beautiful piece of art. So you have to start with where people are, but you can always access something. And that's part of what existential therapy is about. Viktor Frankl is sort of the father of existential psychotherapy or logotherapy. And he was a Austrian Jew. He was in the Holocaust. He was in the camps. His wife was murdered. His pregnant wife was murdered. The rest of his family he lost. He even lost his book that he was writing, which he struggled to hide forever from the Nazis. but they took it and they burnt it. So he survived the death camp with nothing but what he had inside. He had a richness of life that was inside, that you can't take that away from. No one outside can take away what's inside. You're you have one thing that you can do in your life, and that's respond to your suffering. You can't change your suffering, but you can respond to it. And it's just, how are you going to do that? What are the ways that you're going to respond that will enrich your life? And in fact, he credits his response to suffering as the thing that enabled him to survive. He wasn't the strongest man in the death camp, but he may have had a core of belief that allowed him to live.
Mm. Mm. Which brings us back, very centrally to that he who has a why can endure
That's right. Anyhow.
anyhow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that cultivation of that capacity, that internal capacity to even have the awareness of the choice of response, which I think is something that existential approaches really do highlight, often to the confrontation again of the existing worldview, perhaps. I don't have choice about that, or this has happened to me, I have to respond in this way. It's kind of like moments of, I don't know, is it interruption, or is it just moments to pause that allow some wondering around those cracks to come in of maybe there's not a better way, but maybe there's a different way. Maybe there's some choice here. Maybe there's choice where I hadn't realized there's choice.
I think that Nick Cave said in one of his songs, it's the cracks in a pot that let in the light. And when we talk about the crack of our worldview, maybe there's a real possibility of expanding who you are and what the world is. Maybe you then have the actual authority to decide what's right for you. Maybe, in your dream bubble, you were proceeding with your assumptions and your dogmas, but when everything gets screwed up and it's the end of the world, you get to look around and think, what really matters and how am I going to respond to it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that interrelationship between joy and sorrow that you were naming before. There's those beautiful lines from Khalil Gibran, I believe. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. This kind of
Yeah, that seems right.
way in which the experience of suffering, not the event itself, but the process of that suffering and how we find our way, sometimes feeling as though it's blindly in this void, how we find our way through, has some relationship to the capacity to also be able to turn then and appreciate joy, inspiration, in a new way, perhaps. It's this interrelationship. It seems to me that grieving people, I often encounter them coming into contact with that in a very intuitive way, where the experience of it can be present far before there's language, or they might hear a line like that from a poem and be like, yeah, like that.
Yeah.
Why is it, do you think, this is such a foreign thing to people? I'm not saying that grief, death-related grief is the only way this can happen by any means, but it seems to me that people who have experienced suffering get this in a way that is very hard for people to understand outside of those experiences. I'm wondering around why that is.
Well, I don't know. But I also know that some of the greatest art came from suffering, that some of the best music, the best paintings, just the best theories, the best philosophies came from suffering.
Mm.
And that if we live our life in a pleasant way, you, like Kirill said, you lose the depth of your ability to experience joy.
Mm.
And so, people who've done their best to live that way may be missing out. And so then they reach a place where their world is ruptured, and they don't always have at that moment the capacity to process this loss and grow from it. And so what I try to do in therapeutic interventions is start small and help them consider the quiet joys. And once they've touched a quiet joy, maybe then they can reconnect to nature by taking a walk and seeing the leaves and feeling the breeze. And then maybe they'll be ready to shift to consideration of elevating emotions. And in the middle of all of that, the other thing is when you're overwhelmed with your grief, maybe it's okay to divert. Maybe it's okay to have a glass of wine or to exercise and forget about it all. Take some time for yourself and be good in the healing process and allow a wholeness to your life experience to try to re-equilibrate.
Mm.
So yeah, feel the grief, but also gently introduce a balance to your grief that consists of finding meaning in your life and touching on the elevating emotions also.
Mm. And in many ways, those reflections, kind of uh, answer that closing question, I suppose, which was around this idea of people tending to their grief in ways that have some practicality or some skill, some skill learn, some things that can be learned. And I think it's been a recurrent theme, both the encouragement to remember that you can pause and you can still be honoring this. It's not dishonoring to step to look in another direction while still holding everything that you're holding, to take some time to breathe and to relax and to take care of what is often a very pained and suffering being. But then in addition, this idea of being in natural spaces, going and doing
Mhm.
things that we may not have done prior to the bereavement or the grief appearing. But even if we have, it's like going back to those things with a different intent or a different awareness. Some people have talked around going for a walk with your grief, even if no one else is with you, but kind of
Yeah.
being aware of that your encounter with the path. Oh, this path is winding. I can't see right around the corners, and that makes me think of something in relation to this, how hectic this process is. Or, people might not be that kind of lyrical. I don't really want to prescript it too much, but art and music as well. The ability of not using those things as background distractions, the ability of going intentionally to an art gallery with that grief and being like, where will I be met? Where will I be? Where might this experience be echoed? And the same with music, I think, can quite powerfully connect beyond the kind of thinking thought mind.
Yeah, and the emotions of the loss will certainly flood in when you're listening to your favorite song,
Mm.
something you shared with your loved one who's gone. So these are all ways of engaging. Um, and one point that we didn't make at the beginning of this talk that is kind of important is there seem to be at Bill Warden think the bereavement theorist he thinks there's two phases to grief and bereavement. One is flooding, and the other is detachment. And so anyone, not just a therapist, but anyone working with someone who's bereaved will witness folk in both phases of bereavement. And of course, your intervention or your assistance or your reaching out to people will vary based on the phase. If someone is absolutely flooding in their emotions and sobbing and can't get up to work or live their life, then it's time to do some diversion It's time to help them camp down on their feelings so that they can process and move on. But if someone's disconnected from what they're feeling, then it's putting on a piece of music that evokes the feeling and brings them into the remembrance and the suffering. So our interventions can vary a lot, but there are a lot of different ways to heal from our losses. And so the elevating emotions is one part that can balance this. We are all bereaved. We are all multiply bereaved. And recognizing that, I think, has value not only in healing from our loss, but in the ways that we can live our life more authentically.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those reflections and for I could hear in the end of what you were saying just this invitation to be attentive to our own experience, be attentive if we're working alongside people who are grieving in terms of recognizing where it is they might be, trying to get some sense of that, and then responding, you know,
Yeah.
out of that or after that rather than before. So thank you so much, Tom, for everything you've shared with us and for your reflections. I just wanted to make space. Was there any other any other resources or anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
Oh gosh. Um, No, I can't think of anything at this moment. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, I think, is a riveting book. Verena Kast, if people really want to delve into the elevating emotions. I have a talk on multiple loss, which restates some of what we're talking, which I think you'll be able to post at the end. Um, those are sort of my guideposts in processing this stuff.
Mm. Well, we'll certainly link to those resources, and thank you so much again for your time and insight. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be able to share some of my thoughts about this. And thank you for all the work that you guys do
Thank you.
also.
Thanks.